All right, so welcome everyone to the IBS speaker series. We are kicking off for the spring semester and we are very excited. We have a great lineup and we're starting with Alessandro Peri. And as we start each IBS speaker series, we're gonna have just a few brief reminders. So I'm gonna start that. And it's just as we work towards better inclusive practices, we're gonna have things like this at the beginning from here on out. So I wanted to remind everyone that we are recording this meeting. So that means if you want to turn off your cameras, you can feel free to do so at any time. We will also be using the chat and raise hand features for clarifying questions during the presentation, but hold most other questions until the end. So only if you have a question that needs immediate clarification based, that's when you could use the raise hand or the chat feature during the presentation. If you would like to rename yourself to include pronouns so that we can use the proper pronouns, you can feel free to do that. If you need any help with that, you can privately chat me and I can show you how to do that. And then finally, we're going to start including a land statement. And so I'd just like to say that the Institute of Behavioral Science at CU Boulder acknowledges that the university sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, we acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. And now I'm going to pass it off to Keith, who's going to give the introduction, and I will stop sharing as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be very quick here. I'd like to introduce my young colleague, Alessandro Perry, who goes by Ale. Ale originally came to us in 2016, I believe, after his PhD at Carlos Tercera, which is one of the great economics departments in Europe. But then immediately ran into some visa problems, as I recall, and had to go away spent a year at the Bundesbank and other places, and then at Penn before returning here. So anyway, he's going to talk about this interesting paper. I should tell you, Ale is an international macroeconomist, focuses pretty much on financial issues, and his job market paper very interesting on bankruptcies. So Ale, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Keith. So let me share my slides. Okay. Wonderful. Can you actually see them?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a joint project with Keith and with Anna. Anna was a former assistant professor here at CU Boulder. Now she's the chair at Western Galilee College. Now, what we are trying to do with this project, we are trying to identify a particular type of money laundering schemes that we refer to as business-based money laundering using economic theory. Now, since actually, this talk, I'm trying actually to join the IBS. I want to give you a little bit idea of my research. So I'm a macroeconomist with interest in corporate finance and law and economics and computational economics. Now, these last few years from my PhD, I have been working on understanding the phenomenon of corporate defaults, why firms do default in the way they do, with a particular focus on the general equilibrium implications of corporate bankruptcy reforms. So, as instance, in this paper, I'm using financial development in order to reconciling a puzzling spike in default rates with constant credit spreads, and the intuitions when firms have access to credit, they are in a better shape when they do default, so this doesn't affect, so this allows to keep the credit spreads. In my job market paper, basically what I would like to do, the main idea is that I'm warning the policymakers to afford too strong rights to the creditors when workers extract rents. And the intuition is that it suffocates the incentives of the managers to restructure labor contracts. Most recently, I've been working with a member of the IBS, Geronimo, where we are trying to study the general equilibrium implications of bankruptcy reforms in local economy. We are starting basically using bankruptcy shocks in order to recover structural parameters of legal labor markets. Now, today, I'm going to talk about another strand of my research that I'm working on with Keith and for which we applied for a BSF and SF grants. Also thanks to Marisa that helped us in the application process. So hopefully we can get some money out of that. And another strand of research is about computational economics. Now, with this basically part of my research, what I'm trying to do is to fix a problem in economics, which is it takes time to structurally estimate the type of models that I use. To give you an idea, this first paper, Financial Development, took around 1 million CPU hours. For my job market paper, I have just rough estimates. It could be something between 1 million and 2 millions. And the idea is that for estimating this model, I'm using a chip, which is the one that we generally use, which is the one in our processor, in our laptops, that is made basically for checking email or checking Facebook. So what I did in a paper that has been recently published, I would say basically I propose a chip that is specialized, that I specialized in solving economic models. And what we are doing now with a professor at Penn and a professor in the engineer department at Penn, basically what they're trying to do is to make this type of technologies accessible to economists, because there are fixed costs to learn how to program this stuff. Miscellanea, I've been working recently on COVID, because who doesn't? And I've been working also in the last 3 years at the Bundesbank, where in a project, basically we have access to the universe of CEOs in Germany. And we are trying to use this elite in order to understand the phenomenon of cultural colonialism. So the West conquering the East. We have a project about Berlin, Borders Without Borders, where we see that the networks didn't actually match together from the West and East Berlin, and other miscellaneous projects. Okay, so if you want to actually contact me or reach out if you're interested about this counter-colonialism problem, I know that there are many political scientists here. We will be happy actually to discuss it. So let us go back to the paper of today. So today what we're trying to do is really using economic theory to identify a phenomenon of business-based money laundering that has not been well documented in the data. So the idea, let me explain, start from first definitions, which is about money laundering. Money laundering denotes all the ways in which illicit profits can percolate or find their way into the official sector. Clearly, countries share considerable policy concern about the phenomenon of money laundering, and the reason is that the market value of illicit activities is huge. Just to fix some number, so the US illegal drug market in 2010 was almost the same size as the agricultural sector in the United States, or similar to the GDP in Kuwait. And for illicit activities, we don't mean only drug market, but also counterfeited goods, pirated products. This accounts for almost 2% of the global merchandise trade in 2005. So for the ease of exposition, we are going to refer to illicit activities as drug markets. But I want you to keep in mind that this is a broader definition. So the idea includes also contrabanded weapons. Now, what we want to do with this research is to identify a particular type of money laundering that has been extremely difficult to detect, which is business-based money laundering. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, a nice feature of this project is that I can use actually movie picture in order to explain the main idea. So I'm gonna pull the first picture, which is about Breaking Bad. I'm sure you might be familiar with the series. It's the series about this chemistry professor, Walter White, that once diagnosed with lung cancer, he breaks bad and decides to produce meth. Okay, so once he becomes a drug lord and makes a lot of money out of these drugs, he faces the problem, how can I launder this money? And you can see here is the scene where he decides to buy his car wash, and is the scene of the exchange of the keys. So for business-based money laundering, we mean the ways in which these illicit profits find their way into the official sector via a particular channel, which is the purchase of legitimate business. Now, this activity is in generally is, so this type of money laundering scheme in general is helped by professional money laundering, if you want, actors. And existence in the case of Breaking Bad, the role of professional money laundering was actually provided by the picturesque character of Saul Goodman, the attorney. Now, more in general, this has been, the professional money laundering services are provided through shell companies, trust, or private holding that are used in order to shelter the identity of the drug lords. Now, business based on money laundering is a part of what is more generally intended as trade-based money laundering, that, if you want, includes any ways in which these illicit profits find their way into the official sector via the selling of goods and products, so not only legitimate businesses. Now, an issue about trade-based money laundering is that it's extremely difficult to detect. The reason is that in order to be detected, you need abnormal price variation, like, I don't know, a restaurant that buys apples, so, you know, a bunch of apples for $1,000, in order to be detected. So it requires, if you want, an overload of information. Now, we talk with Keith and Geronimo. Geronimo has access to this port data with very detailed information about the products. So an idea was to use, you know, some kind of shocks, like Bitcoin shocks, in order to identify abnormal variation in some types of good, to see whether, you know, what is the channels that has been used in order to launder money. But the question is, if you do not have access to this detailed microdata, how can you identify the phenomenon of business-based money laundering? Now, our approach doesn't require this detailed data. So we are going to propose an approach that basically makes use of public available data. And to do that, we are going to use the big brother of business-based money laundering, which is financial-based money laundering. So again, as promised, I'm going to use another picture in order to present financial-based money laundering. Here's the picture of Scarface, Tony Montana, that is this illegal, actually was legal, migrant from Cuba that became a drug lord. And what he uses in order to launder the money, he uses his friends, the bankier. So more in general, for financial-based money laundering, we mean all the channels that use financial institutions or financial actor in order to launder the money. And to give an idea, we have much more information about financial-based money laundering. And the reason, for instance, there has been these leaked documents from the Treasury Department of Financial Crimes Enforcement Network that estimates 2 trillion suspicious activity from 2000 to 2017. And again, the structure of financial-based money laundering is a little bit more complex than the one that is depicted in the Scarface. So in general, it makes use of these professional money laundering services. And we are going to use these in order to, if you want, in order to implement our identification strategy in a way that we are going to explain later. And yeah, it happens via money layering. You know, there are different techniques in which it's being used. So how can we use financial-based money laundering in order to identify business-based money laundering? The idea is very simple. The idea is that if we assume that TCO, like a traffic cartels organization, uses these two channels in order to launder the money, then we can expect that when it's harder, when authorities makes harder to use one channel to launder the money, we might expect to observe more of the other channel. So we are going to study how anti-money laundering regulation that targets the financial sector affect business-based money laundering. Okay? So to do so, we are going to, if you want, formalize our idea in a trade model where we derive analytically the effect of tighter anti-money laundering regulation on business-based money laundering, so we can identify analytical diselasticity, how a change or making tighter anti-money laundering regulation that target the financial sector affect business-based money laundering. Then we are going to implement empirically this strategy by using an exposure research design approach that uses variation money laundering regulation in Caribbean islands in order to measure the effect on US counties, business activities, okay? And we find that a tightening of the anti-money laundering regulation that happened from 2008 to 2015 in this Caribbean island caused at least, and I'm going to explain what do I mean by at least, a 2% increase in business-based money laundering in exposed counties. Now, we are just computing the numbers just to have an idea, to fix ideas, what does that mean? Now, in the United States, there are 7 million establishments in our exposed counties. So this account basically for 160,000 establishments that at least have been created for money laundering from 2008, which is the value more or less of $300 billion. That's a rough estimate. Okay? So let me move to the model. The model, I'm just going to give you the basic elements and not going through the entire model. This is a general equilibrium model with monopolistic competition. The idea you have a bunch of consumers that consume illicit products and also a bunch of drugs that are sold by the drug cartel. What we study here is the problem of the drug cartel to launder these proceedings in. So what happens here is the following. What we are going to do is to introduce a money laundering technology. The idea is something, you give me $1 dirty money, RE is telling you what the drug cartel actually gets in their pocket. After that, it has to pay the cost for laundering this money. So suppose this is $1, out of that, you get 75 cents. Then the marginal cost is 25 cents, okay? So the drug cartel has access to two channels, financial-based money laundering and business-based money laundering. Financial-based money laundering, the idea we are going to simplify, is a linear technology. For every dollar that you put in, you get, say, 75 cents. Okay, so 1 minus alpha is the marginal cost of money laundering. And when I was visiting Penn, I was discussing with some of the professors there. They said that this is actually a very interesting object to study. So Keith, Anne, and I are planning actually to explore this more in our future research. But also, they can access business-based money laundering. So they can curtail a little bit of this proceeding, Z, say 50 cents, and put this one in business-based money laundering. And this one will have this return. Okay? Now the question is, what is the value of business-based money laundering? Well, for every basically amount of money you put, in order to buy a firms, you have to pay a fixed cost, F. So you can buy M firms with Z amount of money. Okay? Now in the economy, there are this amount of firms, N clean firms, and M that are the crooks firms. So legitimate business that are purchased using illicit money. So what is the value? Well, the value of these firms is given by the profits of this mass of firms, N minus N. But we are going to assume that there is a difference between normal legitimate business and this crooks business, which is we're going to assume that there is some auditing going on. And there is some likelihood of getting audited. And if you're getting audited, you are basically going to be burst with probability 1, in which case all your assets are confiscated. So in expectation, what the crooks can do is 1 minus the likelihood of getting caught. And they will do these profits with this likelihood. Now, the likelihood is given really by how many firms are crooks with respect to the one that are actually legitimate business. So the intuition is that if you buy Apple, you're going to be aided with probability 1. Okay, they're going to ask you, how did you get this money? So the idea of this is create the incentives to hide in very populated, if you want, sectors in order to do that. So our research question is, how can we identify this number of business-based money laundering? What we are going to use regulations that target the yield of the financial sector in order to, if you want to measure this number of firms that are illicit firms. So what does it mean makes it harder? Increasing the marginal cost, reducing the yield. So what we have here, our testable implication, is that the number of crook firms, the semi-elasticity, the percentage change, is greater or equal than the percentage change increases in the legitimate establishment, in the whole establishment in the economy. Okay, so this one characterizes what I mean by at least 2%. So we can measure this object here, and we are going to basically provide a lower bound for this object here. So a conservative measure of business-based money laundering. So all the rest of the paper is about how can we construct this measure of bar 5, anti-money laundering regulation. Clearly, there are endogenous problems if you use anti-money laundering regulation targeting the financial sector at the business at the county level. So we're going to discipline our theory in the US data. We're going to collect US county year establishment, and again, the goal is identify this elasticity, okay? So how the US counties respond to tightening of anti-money laundering regulation targeting the financial sector. So the challenge, the empirical challenge, is constructing this bar 5. The rest of the slides, like the last 10 slides, is going to be about how to construct this measure. So we are going to use an exposure research design approach. And the intuition-based design, this is very simple. We are going to take anti-money laundering regulation that targets the financial sector that are exogenous to the local county business activity. Then we are going to use some measure of exposure to this exogenous variation to construct, if you want, this county year anti-money laundering regulation index that uses this time series variation and this time invariant exposure as a weighted average. Okay, so in terms of the implementation, we are going to use documents from the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force in order to measure the status of compliance of a subset of Caribbean jurisdictions that have been considered events for laundering money or tax evasion. And we construct this index that monitors how compliant they are to anti-money laundering regulation. We give a grade to that. And then we are going to use the Panama Papers that offer links of basically counties all over the world to offshore jurisdictions in order to link this at the county level. Okay, so the next slides, I'm going to first talk about the status of compliance index, and then I'm going to basically talk about the exposure. Anyway, what we do like this, we obtain this exposure to offshore financial regulation. So by using weighted average, we construct this index. So let me start by talking about how we construct the status of compliance index. Then I'm going to move to the exposure, and then we have our index. So let's start with the status of compliance index. Now, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force is part of this international coordinated effort of the Financial Action Task Force that started in 1989 with basically the G7 plus the European Union as an attempt to fight money laundering in the financial sector. Now, the way in which they do it, they set standards, recommendations. And the idea is like this recommendation sets, if you want, the standards of anti-money laundering compliance. This involves both laws, regulation, and enforcement. So you cannot just, it's not sufficient you pass a law, you really have to implement this law. As instance, we are going to see, 3 of these recommendations are about the criminalization of money laundering, how countries act in presence of money laundering. What is the penalty if these drug dealers are caught laundering money, and how they enforce, how each different country enforce this law. And of course, there are also preventive measures. It's like customer due diligence, monitoring transaction, and so forth. So this is a voluntary, basically, international organization. So countries have to opt in. So if they become member of the FATF, by the way, nowadays there are more than 200 jurisdictions that belongs to that, what happens is decide to enter in a mutual evaluation process, a process in which the FATF examiners will give you a grade on each recommendation on how compliant you are to these recommendations, okay? So the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, CFATF, does this for Caribbean economies, okay? We select this just because the resources are scarce. We cannot code all the entire world of the FATF. This is actually part of the grant that we applied together with Keith and Anna. We would like to construct this index for more jurisdictions. So we select a bunch of jurisdictions, which are the ones that you will see are more connected to offshore accounts, which are through the Panama Papers database. So this will include Anguilla, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis. Okay, so let's go back to the mutual evaluation process. How are these ratings issued? The idea is that this rating process starts with a mutual evaluation initial assessment. The idea is that the examiners look at take a picture, if you want, of the regulatory compliance of the country in a particular point at the beginning of the process, and they give a grade, which could be compliant, largely compliant, partially non-compliant, and not applicable. Okay, in our database, we don't have not applicable. Then they will follow with follow-up reports in which examiners check if you are improving in any of these dimensions. So for each one of these 49 recommendations, you get an initial grade. And then the follow-up records, what they do, they just see if there is an update on that. Okay? Now, while the mutual evaluation, they provide a grade, so they provide a compliant, largely compliant, etc. For the follow-up reports, we have to go through the documents and then end code everything. So we are going to look at the documents and do that. We are not using any machine learning or etc. for extracting tests. We look at the documents, look at the regulation, look at the entire history, and see whether there has been an improvement or not. If there is a correction 3 years later, like they made a mistake, we consider 3 years before that they made a mistake. So, everything we make time consistent. So each country, jurisdiction J, in each period T, for each recommendation, one of these 49, get a grade. The maximum you can get as a grade if you're fully compliant is under 47. This is the status of compliance for each jurisdiction in each point in time. I'm going to show you, I'm plotting the status of compliance index for Anguilla, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, etc. You can see everything spans from 2007 up to 2016. For our main analysis, we are going to restrict attention from 2008 up to 2015. And we are going to assume that, since if we don't have data after 2014, we are going to extend the line flat after that. Then in our robustness check, we are going to just look at the effect of each index by itself. This will create also different exposure treated areas and different time periods of exposure. Okay, and our results are robust to all of this. So let me discuss the exposure, the way in which, so the question is, how can we link the status of compliance index, this time series variation by jurisdiction, to the county level? We are going to use the database that has been provided by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to basically get the links of US counties to this jurisdiction. The database is organized in several databases. The Panama Papers is the most famous one, then has been followed by the Paradise Paper, Bahamas Leaks, and Offshore Leaks. And the idea is like it provides information about links between entities, officers, and intermediaries. In our analysis, entities are really our financial institutions. Officers and intermediaries will play the role of these professional money laundering services, if not directly the drug lords. So we are going to construct links. It can be direct links, that is, entities have a jurisdiction in the Caribbean islands, but they have also an address in the United States. Or it can happen that the links is through some officers. So there is an entities in the Caribbean island, but there is an officers in the United States that links this entity to that. So let me just very quickly show you an example on how we compute this exposure share. So here in blue, you have a particular county in the United States. So addresses in a particular county in the United States. These particular counties has links to St. Kitts and Nevis and to British Virgin Islands. It has 2 links to British Virgin Islands, 1 link to St. Kitts and Nevis. So it's going to have 2/3 of exposure to British Virgin Islands, 1/3 of exposure to St. Kitts and Nevis. Okay, here is a direct link. This is an indirect link by an officer. Okay, so that's how we compute the exposure share: 2/3 to BVI, 1/3 to St. Kitts. So in terms of, a possible concern is going to be whether, we have a uniform treatment. Well, luckily, we have all around 36% of the counties that are exposed, that have links. And here I summarize this information. So in total, we have, these are the number of counties. We have, for some of the counties, existence New York counties, we have almost 8,000 links. Of course, we don't care about the absolute level of links. We care about the share. And most of the exposure share is coming from Bermuda, 70%. Okay? Then eventually followed by basically Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands. Okay? So most of our identification will come from Bermuda, and we are going to study this using later in the empirical analysis. And you can see here the shares plotted, share of exposure. So Putting this together as a weighted average, we get for each county our offshore FRI, our shock of anti-money laundering regulation. Now, this is going to be our main specification. We want to check basically how a change in anti-money laundering regulation affects, causes a percentage change in number of establishments. So we are going to regress the log establishment over offshore FRI. Now, of course, there are some empirical concerns. As instance, these links are not randomly distributed, but they're time invariant. So once we control for county fixed effects, we control for that type of concern. Now, there are also concerns about the state tiers fixed effects. We are going to add these, and the reason is that the United States are part of the FATF, so there will be some correlation maybe between anti-money laundering regulation in the United States and the anti-money regulation in CFATF, and we can consider for this unobserved variation at the state tier level by using county fixed effects. Another thing is that our model predicts that the more income the consumer has, the more is going to spend on drugs. So we're going to basically control for real personal income. Importantly, all our controls are lagged in this main specification. Okay, so some concern is that the counties that are exposed might be in a different time trends with respect to counties that are not exposed. So we do the usual parallel trends test before 2008. They are significantly, the difference is significant, it becomes significant after 2008. Okay, now something that is different from the usual diff and diff approach is that in general, after the shock, you should observe, some magnitude of difference between the two. Well, this is not the case if you're thinking about money laundering. And again, you have to keep in mind, this is a shadow phenomenon. If there is an abrupt change that can be detected, then it's hard. Then basically, so they want to be hidden. So you have to use economic techniques if you want regression in order to recover and detect this. So this is our main table. In our main table, we start from a biased regression, where on OLS regression on the shore without controls. Then eventually we are going to add basically personal income. And then we are going to add the county fixed effects and state tier fixed effects. This is going to be our baseline. Okay. We're going to throw then eventually a bunch of controls, the controls for the level of economic activity at the county level or demographics at the county level, and the statistic is pretty stable. Our effect is pretty stable. We consider also when we omit the financial crisis and see, because maybe the financial crisis might have put these counties in different trends. Again, the effect is even stronger with respect to the one that we observed before. Importantly, the financial crisis might affect the counties in different way because of share of poverty, demographics, etc. We are going to also make robustness about that. And the result is robust to that. And again, this 0.0053%, the average effect is going to be around 2.27%. If you look at the average change in the shock in exposed counties, the index increased by 43 percentage point. And if you consider the initial level of establishment in the exposed counties, we are considering about 160,000 establishments that are being created for business-based money laundering purpose, which is, we're considering around $300 billion, okay, the value of business-based money laundering. Let us start with using basically some robustness check in order to check whether what is the contribution of each country to the business-based money laundering. And you can see that if we just consider, instead of our offshore index, our weighted average, the single index, which is basically a procedure that allows to get different exposed counties and also different treatment periods, you see that the effect is pretty stable, okay, and is always significant. What if I compute this for exposed counties, restricting only attention to exposed counties? Again, the effect is pretty stable. So let us move to the heterogeneous effects. Now, our theory predicts that basically that the amount of money laundering depends on the proceedings of the drugs, drug sales, and on the marginal cost of laundering money. And these objects here may vary across counties. Now, we know that the Mexican cartel is responsible of the distribution of the drugs in North America, and that it makes use of gangs that often are Spanish-speaking in order to perform that. So maybe demographics that capture that might be interesting. And similarly, it could be for the financial-based money laundering for the marginal cost of doing that. So we are going to interact our main shock with county characteristics. So this is not just an academic exercise. We really want to provide some guidance to authority to see what are the flags that you can observe in order to understand whether it's going to be more or less money laundering. So the key coefficient is going to be this interaction term. Now here, we are going to present a regression for Hispanic and Asian. Now notice, let me see if I can show you here. Asian was extremely significant, the share of Asian in this slide. And we are going to investigate why that is the case. So you can see that actually the effect is, the direct effect is maintained, but importantly, the interaction term with respect to share of Asian is extremely larger. It's almost 7 times larger than the one with Hispanic, which at the beginning, when we saw this, it was very puzzling. What has to do with the Asian? Once we control, for all our, all the rest of the control. Well, we look at the documents of the National Drug, basically the DA documents, and we found that Asian money laundering organizations actually have emerged in the last years due to a combination of charging lower fees and efficiency of the service they provide in money laundering. So they really affect the marginal cost of money laundering. They allow, if you want, to pay a lower cost in order to access these services. And they collaborate with the other drug cartels, okay? And importantly, in order to do that, Asian, basically, these money laundering services, they recruit Asian Americans. So it's really related to the demographics at the county level. We also keep reading, and you see that these, so the way in which this scheme works is by making use, actually, of transferring funds between China and Hong Kong. So there is, basically, they use this sub-network in order to do that. So what we are going to do is, let us test this hypothesis. If Asian money laundering services actually charge lower fees via a mechanism that makes use of this sub-network, what if we restrict to agents in our links database that are connected to office or intermediaries in China? And let's see whether the effect is stronger. And indeed, whether when we restrict our network to the Asian network, so where there is some direct links to China or Hong Kong, the effect is almost 4 times larger. Okay. After we finish with this heterogeneous, another source of heterogeneity could be, what is the sector? Maybe there are sectors that are preferred in order to launder money. And our theory actually predicts that if you are in a sector that is not very crowded, you are more likely to get busted. You're more likely to get audited. If you buy Apple, you will be probability 1. So what we get is that our theory predicts that sectors whose marginal cost is much larger than the setup cost. If you want the marginal cost that you face are larger than actually starting the business, these sectors will absorb more of business-based money laundering. What we are plotting here, we are plotting the interaction term, offshore times the particular sector. As you can see, manufacturing, the effect is very small, while if you move to retail or, these other services, then it's going to be the effect much larger. Then we move to the geography of business-based money laundering. Is there some region in the United States that actually is more exposed to business-based money laundering? And what we found, basically by running our main regression restricted to particular divisions, we found that actually these exposure track pretty well these documents, this map from the DEA that shows, if you want, the consumption of, with most heroin, most consumption of drugs along the United States. So actually we are picking these effects. And that is it. We have also, we have spillovers effects, etc., but that is tangential to this. So to recap, we propose a model in which we introduce for the first time money laundering technology in order to understand how changes in anti-money laundering regulation that targets the financial sector affect business-based money laundering. And we found economic, if you want, first empirical evidence of business-based money laundering, and appears to be relevant. And that's it. Thank you so much.
I didn't have a chance to read a paper if you had circulated one. Is there any way from this analysis to identify the specific businesses that are associated with this, or you're just identifying a county where there is likely to be this?
We have also businesses that I'm going to show you. So here you can see the businesses for which basically the interaction is stronger. The idea, you can see that when we are talking about retails, those are more likely to be involved in business-based money laundering than other ones, like manufacturing.
Right, but you had indicated that you wouldn't expect to see this effect in sectors that have few businesses.
In terms of, okay.
Right. So Apple's not doing it because your model wouldn't expect, but in industries where you have lots of businesses.
Yeah.
Okay, but that very fact makes it harder to identify the specific.
Which one?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
So David, the only thing you know about that kind of specificity is the address of the link in a particular county.
Mm-hmm.
And those addresses could be traced, tracked down as of the time year. But you can't identify specific restaurants that are open for this purpose, if that's the question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's fine. I just was curious. Yeah, this could.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, we would be targeted otherwise by the drug laws at that point. So we are glad that it doesn't.
Right, but putting aside the issue of targeting, so what you're identifying is the extent to which this is occurring, but not precisely where.
Exactly. Well, also precisely where. So we have existence an idea also about spillovers effects. So the regions that are more, we cannot say though this is legitimate or not. We can just point out that if this county has all these links with this exposure and has these types of businesses, it's going to be very likely that it's technologically more efficient for the drug laws to lose the county than others to do that.
I was thinking of this when you started the talk. Is there any, maybe in a specific county, some other work that has been done that specifically identified the businesses that were involved in this? And could you validate the model by saying, okay, this is where we predict there would be more, and we have seen case studies of two counties next to each other, and it fits the values that our model predicts?
That's something that is interesting, isn't it? So what you are raising here is the point that, when you provide first empirical evidence, is difficult to have, to validate, to have some external validity. I think if we go through the DEA reports, the only point is that, if we go systematically through the DEA reports, we might find something. I think this is actually a very valuable things to do. I agree with you. That will be a good way for validating our model.
Nice. Thank you.
Clara, do you have your hand up?
Hi. Super interesting. I really liked it. I have 3 clarifying questions. And then the first one is similar to what David just asked. But in your analysis, you have the number of establishments. Is that total number of establishments in that county?
Yeah.
Or is it, yeah?
Good. Yeah.
So then what is the ratio, expected ratio of the business-based money laundering firms within the total establishments?
Oh, we provide only a lower bound for that. What we mean is that, let me show you. That's actually a beautiful question. So, yeah. So we observe M, the total establishment at the county level. We don't observe M. What we know is only that this is a lower bound for this. So what we are measuring is saying that if this has increased by 3%, this has increased by much more. That's the only thing that we can say.
So that comes from your assumption that there are BBMLs, and then that would be, the rate of change would be greater than the rate of change for the total establishment.
It's not an assumption, we derive it analytically. It's coming from the model, a prediction of the model.
But do you have a sense, like empirically, in say one county, what would be the ratio of the business-based money laundering? Because there may be a county where there is none, right? I mean, aggregate there may be.
Absolutely. This is going to be, so we do not have that information. That's why we use this we only have a conservative watch that says that it is less or equal than that. But of course, there is noise. You know, these are illicit activities.
Okay, cool. And then the second question was this tightening in AML. How many times has it changed? Because you're looking at the Treasury driven laws, right, in the US. How many times has it changed, or is it just in the one time, like in 2008? And what has changed? What do you mean by tightening AML?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So you said the anti-money laundering legislations by the Treasury, and then you're looking at the tightening of it over time. Or how many times has it changed, or is it just one-time change, and then you're looking at that? And then what has changed?
Oh, I might have misspoken. So the anti-money laundering regulation changes are coming from these jurisdictions in the Caribbean islands, and it depends by the jurisdiction. So you can see is a series of follow-up reports. Let me just show you. Maybe I have a slide that shows what do they look like. Yeah, here some document from Anguilla show that money laundering offense, there have been no money laundering prosecution. So this is largely compliant. We cannot say if today is compliant or not. And then eventually became compliant when we see where there have been prosecution of 6 cases. So there is also enforcement. So for each jurisdiction, we have a rating there.
I see. Okay, so you're only looking at the Caribbean countries, AML changes over time.
Yeah,
that you code. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the third one, asking as an Asian, are the significant effects for Asians, are these counties where these are cities? Like where many Asian Americans live in cities? So it's not about Asian per se, but it's about cities. And also given that other races are also significant.
Yeah, but we have county fixed effects that should control for that, right? If it is a city or not. The county fixed effects will tell me this is a city or not, so that will control for this variation.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the omitted baseline category with these race variables?
Is natives, and then eventually there is also others, which is, so these are a share of black, not mixed. There is also mixed.
So Asian is significant here
We
relative
respect
to Native American, but relative to white, we can't be sure.
Okay, so you suggest, because actually we received these comments, Kif, right, before. Do you suggest to have white as the baseline?
I don't know, it depends on your hypothesis, but relative to Native American, it may obscure things a little bit.
Okay. That's, yeah, I mean, I didn't make this disclaimer, but I'm in computational economics and macro. So there is no real empirical expert among us, but, you know, we have a nice question we wanted to address. So any comments about how to make the empirical analysis sharper is more than welcome. Would you, so if you read this, what would you like as a baseline? Would you prefer to have white?
That would be my instinct, but yeah, again, it kind of depends on what you want to compare. Asians and other categories too.
Perfect.
These variables are all pretty, in any given year, that's pretty slow moving. I mean, through time, there's certainly trending, but in any given year, is that enough meaningful change?
Yeah, that's actually, well, the only thing I can say is that, yeah, there is a change that is economically significant.
Mm-hmm.
Statistically, economically, I have to think that's.
Okay. I did want to ask one more fun question. On the slide you were showing, David, I think it's slide 38. Mm-hmm. It looks like educational services ranks pretty high. And as an employee of an educational institution, I'd love to know what money laundering through an educational institution looks like.
I'm thinking about, you know, all these centers that help students tutoring or something like that. That is very easy to build up. You need, you know, it's, you know, a bunch of tutors, so it's just a marginal cost. You get an office that could be, you know, now you can do it in Zoom. So for sure, it's not, I don't think it's universities. I hope so, but I don't think it's universities. And I think there, the important part, you should read there is the marginal cost to fixed cost, fixed setup cost. Those are the, what we should give you the idea. University have a big fixed setup cost. We know that.
Jason, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So going back to your very first slide, you don't need to go back there if we're going to use Scarface and Breaking Bad to orient ourselves in the terms of how we think about this. Let's invite Don Corleone briefly into the room. And what does he do to Sollozzo? He turns down Sollozzo's offers, says, in this family, we don't have anything to do with drugs. And he basically tells Michael and Sonny and everybody involved, like, this is what we do and this is what we don't do. So there's two issues here. One is who we are. And so right now you're talking about these organizing groups and these cartels. And there's a in that specific case, a very clear understanding of what we do and what we don't do. So there, dare I say it again, there are norms with respect to what's right and what's wrong. But more importantly, the enforcement of those norms are incredibly dependent on who's in charge. And in that case, Vito, Don Corleone. So in a silly way, they seem oppositional, opposed, but they come together in a very unique way in the way you framed this metaphor. And I'm wondering how, if we're generating a general theory, and yet it's very dependent on the unique organization and the individual, is it generalizable at all? So those are my big questions. And then my small question is, when you have an R squared of 1, how can you get a standard error estimate? That's my other question. Sorry to be that guy.
Yeah, I'm going, so they are squared, I mean, in panel data, I don't know the interpretation of that. So I'm gonna leave it, I'm gonna, you know. Let me first start with the first point. I think still they are generalizable. The reason is the following. Think about it, at least your example of Corleone. Corleone is just, we don't mess with drugs. So is the selling of the products that create the proceedings. But in terms of money laundering, we find whatever we can to launder the money. Our story is not about the story where the E is created, it's about how we launder once we have E. So that's the point. So unless, you know, you don't want to use Bitcoin, you know, for some reason, then eventually, you know, that is a restriction, but, you know, you want to, it's an asset portfolio decision. You want to have the best return and you allocate the resources to get that. In terms of the R squared, again, I remember, you know, I am not an applied microeconometrician. The only thing I remember from my classes is that R squared in panel data, they don't mean much. Even not in panel data don't mean much, but that's, is a realization. I don't know what, if you don't give me the standard error or the R squared, what does that mean?
With all these fixed effects and that is kind of a sample size, that's pretty common in economics. So what you're trying to look at is these marginal coefficients and the significance of those things. And with the right clustering, which I think we have, these are okay.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Keith. And the other thing is about, we check also different correlation between the shocks. I didn't mention about that. Correlation, general year errors are correlated at the county level. We explore also state variation. Something we did not mention, since I had 2 minutes, is that one could be concerned that these links also are about tax evasions. But in the case of tax evasions, they go, actually is good because they go on the opposite direction. You can think about tax evasion as a technology that allows you, so if you go back to Solo, where there, the more taxation you have, the less investment you have. And investment in business establishment is just one type of investment. And tax evasion is just a technology that makes you pay less taxes. So if you actually have money laundering regulation that targets tax evasion in these islands, then you will have less business. So this, if you want to bias downwards, our estimates. Okay. Well, thank everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming. We do have more events listed on the website. I put the link in the chat. And next week's is a workshop that if you can register in advance for it, there's the link is on the event page. That would be great. But thank you all for coming.
Good job, Ali. Thank you.
Thank you so much.